Hello, I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE. This podcast is brought to you by RANE Worldview, the premier digital publication for objective geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Find out how RANE can help you stay ahead of global events at ranenetwork.com.
This is RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. I'm Emily Donahue. Welcome aboard. In this episode, we're talking about the United States' efforts to curb China's access to advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, a move that could seriously disrupt China's chip ambitions. Here with details is Matthew Bay, RANE's Senior Global Analyst. Welcome, Matthew.
How are you, Emily?
I'm good. It's great to have you here. Can I ask you to summarize the latest moves that the United States has made against China's semiconductor sector?
Yeah, so earlier this month we had the United States Commerce Department, one of its bureaus, announcing a number of different restrictions all on the same day. One of these, for example, basically blocked the sale or exports, or at least required companies to apply for a license for, of advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment that would be used to manufacture very advanced semiconductors that are in the area of powerful logic chips, and more advanced memory chips. In addition, the Commerce Department also listed a number of companies, including YMTC, which is one of China's leading state-owned memory chip companies, on its unverified list, which basically means that U.S. officials can't really verify and investigate them. And then they also made it easier for them to move companies that are on the unverified list to what is called the entity list. And the entity list is significant as that is basically a blacklist that is one of the harshest in terms of blocking U.S. exports to those companies in question. Now, the U.S. has allowed some loopholes, so they've said that they will grant some temporary authorizations, and they have done so already, but that's mainly going to foreign companies that are actually building those chips and making those chips inside of China. So, for example, TSMC or Samsung, not necessarily your Chinese state-owned semiconductor manufacturers.
So what is the U.S. trying to do with this, and could they be successful?
So yeah, the U.S. is trying to effectively make it so China does not have access to advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment, because that's the Achilles heel of China's overall chip ambitions. The U.S. really doesn't want to see, for a number of reasons, China's chip sector rivaling the United States, rivaling U.S. allies, etc. And if you read the Biden administration's national security strategy, which was released earlier this month, it clearly states that the U.S. will try to prevent China, adversaries technically, from gaining those technologies, and export controls is one way of doing that. So effectively, the U.S. is saying that not only do I want to, limit China's growth as a geopolitical power, but I also want to make sure that its economic power is also somewhat limited. Now, can they be successful? The answer is, probably. When you look at the chip industry, semiconductor manufacturing equipment is among the most significant and most technologically advanced in the industry. And it's one where Chinese companies are multiple generations, almost, you can measure the time behind their international peers almost in decades for some of their chip manufacturing equipment providers. So without that equipment, we're talking about basically leading Chinese semiconductor manufacturers, not even the equipment manufacturers, remaining, a few generations behind the leading edge, which means that, Chinese-built and indigenously Chinese-built semiconductors will not be as advanced as U.S. manufactured or Japanese manufactured or Taiwanese manufactured, and that, from the U.S.'s perspective, will give the leg up to international competitors, as well as the leg up to the U.S. military when it comes to military applications. And in the U.S., like I said, will probably be somewhat effective, just given the fact that you're talking about a stranglehold over a key piece of technology that China will take 5, 10, maybe even longer years to actually develop in-house.
So this sounds like a pretty significant step. What would China possibly do in response?
So obviously, China will still try to support its indigenization strategy when it comes to chip manufacturing. These kinds of moves just reinforces to China's leadership that the need to basically diversify and well, not diversify, just basically manufacture as much of it at home and reduce reliance on foreign technology. Now, what they can't do is necessarily gain that just overnight. But there are some things that we can anticipate moving forward. For example, we would expect the Chinese government to expand or at least maintain a high level of financial support for those companies. We would anticipate, a higher reason for them to carry out, say, what the U.S. would perceive to be illicit activities like stealing IP, cyber espionage, those kinds of things, and giving over trade secrets to Chinese competitors. But I think the other thing to think about more broadly is, all things considered, China really hasn't gone aggressively against U.S. companies in retaliation for a number of different restrictions that the U.S. put into place over the last 4 or 5 years. When you look at the way that China responded to President Trump's trade war, we didn't really see them doing anything around, say, a U.S. companies' business interests in China. They didn't go after a Walmart in a very significant way. They didn't go after KFC. They didn't go after any of these companies. Now, a number of these companies had run-ins with China for various issues, but we didn't really see as significant as in for example, nationalizing a U.S. multinational corporation's assets in China. We didn't see any of that. While China hasn't done that, what it has done over the last few years is it's built up essentially a number of different legal mechanisms that it can use eventually to start to list U.S. companies on. So they have what they now are calling the anti-foreign sanctions list. They have what's called the unreliable entities list, which are similar counterparts to what the U.S. has. And it is possible that at some point, if the U.S. makes as significant moves, and I think the one that we're seeing right now against the semiconductor is among the most significant the U.S. has made, if not the most significant, at some point, China may reassess whether or not they need to not just have these lists on paper, but start putting companies on them in a much more aggressive fashion. They've only done that really sparingly, to be honest.
What does this tell us about the broader U.S. strategy against China?
What is significant about the latest round of restrictions is that it's not necessarily just going after specific companies. Yes, the U.S. as a part of the announcements did list YMTC on its unverified list, but we saw basically a sanction or restrictions against an entire swath of the Chinese economy. The semiconductor industry at large when it comes to these more advanced chips. Previously, the most of the things that we had seen, with the exception of a few things like the trade war being one example of that, we had seen most of the tech restrictions being focused on specific companies. So, for example, the listing a few years ago of Huawei, the smartphone manufacturer, on the entity list, placing a number of drone companies on the entity list, creating a new list of companies that are close to the Chinese military, and restricting U.S. investment into those companies. But what's different now is they're at least signaling a willingness, either knowingly or unknowingly, I guess, to be honest. They're signaling a willingness to actually go against China in a much more holistic fashion, targeting sectors as opposed to companies, which does bring a different kind of risk in terms of the types of business activities that can be restricted by a U.S. business. Obviously, if you're only restricting advanced semiconductors to a Huawei, that's one thing. But if you're saying you're restricting AI and other chips to all of China, that's an entirely different thing when it comes to what companies can do. And moving forward, there are a few other proposals that are on the table that would be in a similar fashion. The one that I'm going to draw example to is the proposal by the U.S. to set up a new board that would review outbound investments into China. Now, there's a lot of movement on Capitol Hill against this idea, but if there's a review mechanism to look at investments into China over national security, that is again going to deter investment into China, into say the semiconductor industry, or into the broader industry for just internet technology in general. So that would be again more of this kind of sectoral hit as opposed to specifically going after just Chinese companies on a case by case whack-a-mole basis.
Matthew Bay is RANE's senior global analyst. His analysis appears in RANE Worldview, the risk intelligence app for professionals, and our consumer publication, which offers objective geopolitical analysis and intelligence covering the global landscape. You can find out more about RANE and its products, including RANE Worldview, at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emily Donahue. Thanks for listening.